Hello, I'm an Oxbridge Singaporean, and today I will be doing what I hope is an educational video on the poem London by William Blake. As you may know, of course, William Blake was born in 1757 and died in 1827. He's a famous English poet and also a painter and a printmaker. Of course, what's interesting is that he was a Londoner who lived through massive social and economic upheavals due to the Industrial Revolution as experienced in the UK, and also international political tensions caused by the French Revolution. So he lived in somewhat impoverished circumstances and so was a first-hand witness to the social problems of London's industrialization. So often his work has political and humanitarian purposes, since he was concerned about suffering and its alleviation in his community of souls. So first I will read out the poem London, and then we will proceed to do a commentary. By the way, there is a very useful book by Edward Larcy, and I hope you can see this. It's quite a good commentary. Larcy, of course, when he published the book, was a lecturer in English and comparative literature at the University of Warwick. So first, the poem itself. London. I wander through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So the last stanza is, but most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Right. So this famous poem is interesting because it starts with a speaker, supposedly a man of leisure, a person of leisure, who's wandering through the streets of London. But of course, what's interesting about these streets is that it's charted. Now, charted, of course, is a loaded word because it suggests that it's been legally mapped out. But as some commentators have pointed out before, charted also suggests that there are legal restrictions, and so instead of giving rights to people, it could actually be restricting other people's liberty. Notice how the chartering takes place not just for the street but also for the River Thames, because it says near where the charted Thames does flow. Okay, so the next two lines, mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So of course plays with the double meaning of mark, because the first mark in every face, means noticed or pay attention to. The second meaning of mark in marks of weakness, marks of woe, of course means signs of weakness or traces of weakness and of suffering. So that's an interesting use of double meaning, wordplay. Then in the next stanza, when it says, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, notice how this is an absolute statement because nobody is exempt. Now, of course, for some commentators, and we will talk about some of their points later, this raises the question of the extent to which the speaker of the poem is himself or herself included in this universal suffering, and whether or not the speaker can in fact jump out of this perspective. So, and And of course, in this stanza comes the famous phrase, mind forged manacles. Of course, the compound word mind forged suggests that these chains or cuffs, handcuffs, if you like, are created by the human mind. They are mental, and these mental constraints actually can restrict the behavior of people. So the next stanza says how the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls. Of course, if you know a bit of English history or European history, you would know that chimney sweepers tended to be young boys, little boys who could squeeze into the chimneys and clean them. And of course, these chimneys are not just residential, they could belong to factories. Of course, this is a form of child abuse by today's standards, but it was normal in European industrialization to use children for work. It's a 20th century thing, by the way, that children have started to enjoy rights such as the right to education instead of work. Okay, next line. Every blackening church appalls. Now, notice the reference to a religious institution, and again there is wordplay in the verb appalls, because appalls can mean shocked or horrified, but at the same time it can also mean turn pale, whitened, in other words. So when it says how the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls, it's contrasting the blackness of the chimney sweeper's soot, because the boys would be encrusted by soot, obviously, and the church, of course, could be covered by the pollution as well. But the cry, the sound, makes pale the church. And so there is a sort of indictment of religious authority in these lines. And the next line, the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Hapless, of course, means unfortunate. So the sigh of the soldier marks a red trail which can be found on the wall of the ruler's magnificent residence. So here's a thought, a kind of a protest, a political protest of the conscripted warrior against the king who forces him to fight his wars. And then the last stanza, but most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. Now it has been pointed out the youthful harlot's curse, of course, could be due to venereal disease, and that's why the infant is tearing or crying due to the congenital disease being passed on to the child. But of course, if we just read it in a more literal fashion, it's just saying that the speaker can hear a young girl who's been forced into prostitution, usually by poverty, how this young prostitute is cursing an unwanted baby. And on top of that, the young prostitute blights with plagues the marriage hers, is wishing ill on all marriages, perhaps because her particular lover has betrayed her and is married to somebody else, or has gotten married to somebody else. Because, as we know, prostitutes had lots of gentlemen clients, so who actually were married in European history. And of course, in Victorian literature, we also know that, in fact, syphilis, a venereal disease, was quite a major problem and could make congenitally affected people go mad. Okay, so that's the poem. Now for some interesting ideas on the poem. We have already pointed out how this poem actually highlights the significance of perception, in particular the importance of perception transcending appearance. Now the verb mark, of course, can also mean inscribe upon, and so there is a suggestion in an alternative interpretation that in fact the speaker is the one inscribing marks of weakness and woe on the people he encounters. So this suggests the subjectivity of the speaker, because this inscription may not be actually what's on the face of the people the speaker meets. So this could be an ironic attempt at undermining the speaker's sort of superior, detached perspective from the general suffering he sees. So the inclusivity or the inclusiveness of his statements that every person he meets, every Londoner, is an interesting one because it makes us question to what extent the speaker himself is free from it. Now, in Larissy's book, of course, he points out an interesting observation from the Marxist critic Walter Benjamin, who says, fear, revulsion, and horror were the emotions which the big city crowd aroused in those who first observe it. And by the time Blake wrote of London, London was already a very big city, in Benjamin's sense. So that's an interesting observation. And in fact, Engels, again quoted by Larissy's book, Engels, who was a good friend of Karl Marx, Engels says that Londoners have had to sacrifice what is best in human nature in order to create all the wonders of civilization with which their city teems. There is something distasteful about the very bustle of the streets, something that is abhorrent to human nature itself. Now, of course, Engels came quite a while after William Blake, but the point I think still holds, even though we are talking about a later period of capitalism. The sense of alienation, the way London, the poem London, describes an alienated, isolated speaker wandering around in the streets of London. I think that sense is quite clear. So of course, the fact that the speaker is somehow damagingly marked by alienation might make us consider the extent to which his perspective is the exemplary one. So of course we can see that the speaker is sympathetic, but there is perhaps a bitter or subtle irony in the fact that a new perspective, a different vantage point is actually very hard to establish, because this supposed pure perception outside the ideologies, discourses and struggles of that historical era, this perspective outside of the speaker's universe is really practically impossible. At least the poem questions this. So of course, the emotions of indignation, of anger at this social injustice, they're all there in the poem. But the thing is that some more recent, more sophisticated commentary has pointed out that the poem is stranded between two readings. One is that it's a critique of a social system, and the other one is it's something ironic about the speaker. So those are rather interesting ideas presented by this book on William Blake by Edward Larissy. So in addition to that, of course, I think we need to point out that William Blake, the fact that he's an illustrator, may actually have inspired the graphic novel, because there's supposedly some influence on Alan Moore, the famous graphic novelist. Now, what's interesting to note, of course, is that London is part of Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and poems in the two sets of songs are frequently paired, but London has no obvious pair in the Songs of Innocence, even though it provides a very strong counterpoint to the trend of poetry at that time to celebrate and romanticize the British landscape. Because as we pointed out, the last thing it does is to romanticize anything at all, right? Because why? Because the city of London seems to imprison the soul and energies of all the wretched citizens. It's almost like a life sentence they have to serve. They are apparently trapped physically by the boundaries of the city's charted streets and river, and they are also mentally bound by the mind-forged manacles of a corrupt morality that is supposedly upheld by the institutions, the malicious institutions of industry, church and government, or at least self-serving institutions of industry, church and government. That's one possible reading of the poem. So if of course Blake came at the end of the what's called the Age of Reason, towards the end of the 18th century, which celebrated reason. In this poem, and perhaps this is why Blake can be considered a forerunner of the Romantic movement, in this poem, reason is as much the enslaver as the abusing institutions. Now we have to remember, of course, at that time, Newton was regarded as the embodiment of reason, and actually Blake hated Newton as the representative of reason. So the mind-forged manacles imprisoning the spirits and bodies of Londoners could also suggest the fires of huge factories at that time, and also the filthy chimneys, and this industrial power, has been blackening the entire city. But of course, the blackness is also suggestive of the corrupt morality of the owners and managers, whose wealth is built on the backs of abused workers. So moving on, what's again interesting in one of the, according to the writers Sayers and Monin, is that London may in fact also be referring to two works that are very important to the Western tradition and also to Blake. The one is Milton's Paradise Lost, and the second is the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments. So it's arguable that in fact Milton's description of Adam and Eve after the fall, when they have been exiled from Eden, Milton's description of how they make their solitary way, quote unquote, with wandering steps and slow, unquote, is actually reminiscent, is actually what inspired the persona's creation. Because we have a wandering persona, and he's going around strolling and observing the misery and the suffering of Londoners. So that's a very illuminating insight, I think. The other one, of course, is the Bible. In fact, a famous critic, Harold Bloomer, I think, has pointed out that actually there could be a reference to the Old Testament, because to specifically to Ezekiel 9:4, and in Ezekiel it says, I quote, "And the Lord said unto him, Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry, for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof." So the relevant part, of course, is set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh. And it continues, "And to the others he said, In mine hearing, go ye after him through the city, and smite. Let not your eyes spare, neither have ye pity. Slay utterly old and young, both maids, and little children and women. But come not near any man upon whom is the mark." So the obvious interpretation of the poem is something like, the suffering people are righteous, the church and the king be damned. However, this could be a weak and unproductive misreading. It could be that Ezekiel is present as the precise measure by which Blake reveals that he himself is also weak and woeful, and not the Ezekiel-like prophet he should be, and that he has repressed this knowledge. Now notice Bloom talks about Blake himself, but it's probably better to talk about the speaker, because the identification of the speaker with the author is fraught with difficulties. So the speaker seems to be implicated in the evil he perceives. And this may also help to explain how the prophet, who would seem to mark or inscribe, is really the weak, woeful, and alienated observer who marks in the sense of merely noticing, and is himself marked by not being Ezekiel. So this is a rather sophisticated interpretation. So the marker in Ezekiel is a writer. Writing in London is contrasted to the lost prophetic voice, and the poem is in a way sort of anti-writing in a sense. Okay, so Blake, of course, arguably in this poem, if he is following the Ezekiel persona, is separating sheep and goats, people and rulers, in a way Ezekiel does. So, but then of course, why shouldn't Blake think that the people will be safe and the rulers damned? Don't forget, Blake was a radical, after all. So apart from expressing the righteous indignation of God and foretelling the punishment of the wicked, in this case the church and the king, what's wrong with a bit of sort of nostalgia for the Old Testament? I think is the idea. But of course, E.P. Thompson, it's noted that E.P. Thompson has pointed out that Mark could be referring to the mark of the beast in Revelation 13:16 and the mark of Cain in Genesis 4:15. So Thompson notes that the mark of Cain could carry the ambivalence that men are both agents and patients, culprits and victims. Okay, so that's another interesting link with the Bible, which of course Blake would have known, but which Blake did not swallow hook, line and sinker. Not totally. So in other words, London shows, the poem London, shows that we all bear the mark of the tyrannies of priest and king. But of course the question is, are we going to do anything about it? So, Blake is simultaneously attracted by the radical view of state versus people, and by the sterner view, for which there was also scriptural support, of a whole people accursed. So, that's a thought. Okay, now moving on. Blake's narrative art typically, of course, as we have noted, aims to politicize the reader, not only through the creation of pity and fear in the Aristotelian sense of the tragic narrative, but to literally move the audience to feel guilty and therefore to act. So the question is, as a call to action, how does the poem London fare? So that's an open question which I will leave to you to consider. Of course, if you like, you can write a comment. Okay, so of course this relates to the question of how literature and art may be significant to social and political criticism, may disrupt and contest meta-narratives, and potentially politicize readers. But of course, at the end of the day, the question is, to what extent? And does it move people to action? There is an interesting note, interesting comment by Sayers and Monin about how, they're citing Joyce 2003, how the abstract space of the city was achieved largely through mapping practices so that the abstract and also gendered gaze of the map gave a superior detached view from above. Now that's an interesting comment about the mapping and the chartering, the spatial mapping of London in the poem, because that activity or that action of marking also marks London's citizens. So it seems like every person and material thing is inscribed by language, with language. So this typically, this idea of mapping and chartering, of course, is from a superior vantage point, but arguably Blake does a different kind of marking and chartering from the ground up. So you could argue Blake answers the question of how people ought to respond to marking and chartering by providing a view of the city from the ground up. So in a way, you could argue, if you interpret the speaker as a little more activist, that this ground-up view is itself a kind of political indictment, is itself a kind of action. So again, that's an open question. I leave different viewers to comment on it if they wish. The next point that I find interesting is that the city often, in the poem, resonates through this poetic voice, almost incantatory poetic voice, and we are led through different senses to, quote unquote, feel the authority of suffering others through Blake himself as a prophetic intermediary. Okay, so this is a phrase from Monin says, I repeat, invite the reader in to feel the authority of suffering others through Blake himself as a prophetic intermediary. So, because why? Because Blake's speaker voiced injustice so that the dead and dishonored continue to participate, arguably even to the present, about the city of London, up to today, arguably. So another interesting comment is that the city is as much an imaginary place as a real place where time and space is disjointed. That's an interesting idea, to see a city as the conjunction of time and space, and often a conjunction that is also disjointed, where in today's world at least there could be practices of resistance to do with movements, in the city, such as a protest march, long walks to freedom, taking to the streets. So that's an interesting contemporary comment. And of course, in the context of Singapore, if you think about Hong Lim Park, for instance, it's interesting to note that it is a confined space, right, in the case of Singapore. So long walks and other city-related practices are not encouraged, obviously. Okay. And to conclude, there is the tendency, of course, to read the poem as holding the message that we ought to unmanacle perception from the limits imposed by language. But of course, it's an open question whether or not the speaker of the poem manages to open the doors of perception and bring us through those doors. So, and that is a question that continues to be debated. So I find this poem, of course, fascinating, and in addition to all of those comments, we should note that in an earlier draft of the poem, actually Blake substituted chartered for the simpler pejorative word dirty of, in earlier drafts. So this change from dirty to chartered, this choice, of words, this diction, reinforces a political interpretation. And what's interesting also is in earlier drafts, Blake, in fact, for the famous phrase, "my forged manacles." Blake actually chose the compound word German forge. It's not my forged manacles, it's German forged manacles. So, so here we have something that is a choice on the part of the poet, attempting to emphasize the mental. So it's all encompassing. There are physical chains and mental chains, and it gives us, I think, a more philosophical perspective on the anguish that the speaker witnesses in the city. So all in all, a very powerful poem, very open-ended, very interesting, and even today. Thank you.